Wonderful. Welcome to the final event in PSECO's Antarctic event series, Antarctic Governance 101. I'm Mariama Dryak. I'm the director for the Polar Science Early Career Community Office, or PSECO, a national level office that supports polar scientists early in their careers through community building, professional development, funding, and more. And PSECO is hosted at the University of Colorado Boulder with CERES and INSTAR, two institutes there. Today, we will be helped with technical support by Casey Marsh, a colleague of mine at CERES Education and Outreach. She just gave a wave there at the University of Colorado Boulder. So if you've run into any bumps along the way, feel free to reach out to Casey or to myself during the call, and we can help assist you with those things. We will be hearing from Kimberly Aiken and Ikra Chowdhury. Kimberly Aiken, a research and policy associate with the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, provides support to a host of Antarctic environmental campaigns, such as marine protected areas, krill conservation, tourism in Antarctica, and climate change through digital storytelling, maps, and online engagement. Kimberly is an incoming PhD candidate at the University of Tasmania, Australia Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies. She's excited about the work of early career researchers such as herself and providing value and effort to DEI initiatives in the polar community. Welcome, Kimberly. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Ikra Chowdhury is a science communication professional whose PhD thesis focused on the role of international scientific collaboration in Antarctic governance, and she's supported as a rapporteur at the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting on several occasions. Welcome, Ikra.
Thank you so much for having me.
At the core of PSECO is inclusion, and so we expect all attendees will adhere to PSECO's community guidelines when interfacing with others on the call, which Casey is pasting a link to in the chat. But to summarize, please be kind and respectful in asking questions at the end of the talk. And we'll first hear for the first 47 minutes from Kimberly and Ikra, and we'll have 10 minutes at the end for questions. For those questions, you can send them directly to me, Mariama Dryak, in the chat, and I'll sift through them and try to ask some I'm hearing a couple of times so that Ikra and Kimberly can speak a little bit more to some of those burning questions that you have. But without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Kimberly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariama, for that lovely introduction, and to Casey for doing all of the background work. Before I get started, I'd like to say it's a great honor and privilege of mine to deliver this presentation from the land of the Mohinir Aboriginal people of Taroona, Lutrawadi, Tasmania, Australia. And, as Mariama mentioned, I am Kimberly, and I'm a research and policy associate with the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition. And I come to you today to present on past, present, and future projections of Antarctic governance. The next slide, please. So before we go directly into Antarctic governance, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, and then I will go into, the Antarctic Treaty System, which is comprised of two parts: the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting, the Committee for Environmental Protection, and then the Commission on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. And then we'll look at some challenges that we're currently experiencing right now with Antarctic governance, followed by some conclusions. Next slide, please. So I'd like to start us off with a formal introduction on the history and the work of ASOC. Again, that's the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition. And its role in influencing policy and decision-making for Antarctica and its surrounding ocean, the Southern Ocean. ASOC was founded in 1978 by environmental campaigners that were concerned about, some sort of secret negotiations over the future of mining and oil and gas extraction in Antarctica. And today, ASOC is an umbrella organization that represents a wide variety of environmental groups, and it has 24 member organizations that you can see on the left side of your screen. WWF, Global Choices, Greenpeace, etc. And the organization also consists of staff and campaigners that are based in 10 countries. The work of ASOC is advanced in two main international fora, which you will hear me talk a bit more about in a few minutes, which is the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting, also known as the ATCM, or the Commission on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, also known as CAMLAR. ASOC is also an official advisor to the ATCM and CAMLAR and represents the unified voice of the global environmental community and continues to be the NGO voice for Antarctic environmental protection. And its international approach of ASOC is crucial in a multilateral system such as the Antarctic Treaty System. Next slide, please. So here are a few of ASOC's priorities, work priorities, which include environmental protection, which is, the advocacy for stricter environmental standards and enhancement of current rules and regulations for the Antarctic and the Southern Ocean, wildlife conservation. That includes protecting marine and land species, invertebrates, and migratory birds. Creating a network of marine protected areas in the Southern Ocean, protecting the base of the Antarctic marine ecosystem, which is krill conservation, and raising the profile of Antarctic climate change issues through public advocacy, governance meeting, and outreach campaigns, and of course, looking at responsible tourism in Antarctica. Next slide, please. So here is just a little bit of an overview of ASOC over the years, past and most current campaigns and outreach educational activities that ASOC has participated in. ASOC carries out a wide variety of activities, ranging from public awareness, policy science workshops, webinars, and advocacy with Antarctic Treaty governments. And so here recently on August 11th of 2022, we hosted with partners the first ever World Krill Day. We also, publish and have different campaigns ongoing around World Penguin Day. ASOC was very active in the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting that took place this year in Berlin. ASOC also held a rally for Antarctica at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin to, raise awareness about Antarctic environmental protection, and has also published a digital story map called Securing the Next 30 Years of Antarctic Protection, which can be found on the ASOC website. So this is just gives you an idea of the type of work that ASOC has done over the years and continues to do, to work with governments and help raise the profile of Antarctica to the general public as well. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about the history of Antarctic governance. And so in 1959, 12 original nations signed the Antarctic Treaty, which was to safeguard the continent, reserving the region for peaceful and scientific purposes only. And out of that treaty came three major agreements that you can see here before you, which is the agreed measures for the conservation of Antarctic flora and fauna, which was adopted in 1964, followed by the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Seals, adopted in 1972, and then, the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, known also as CAMLAR Convention, which was adopted in 1980. And so the Antarctic Treaty consultative parties had raised concerns about the environmental impacts and the increase of krill fishing and its effects on the wider Southern Ocean ecosystem. And as a result of these concerns came these three major agreements. A very significant portion of the Antarctic Treaty is the Environmental Protocol, or also known as the Madrid Protocol, and contracting parties committed to comprehensive protection of the Antarctic environment and dependent and associated ecosystems. And the environmental protocol, it was signed on October 4th, 1991 by 31 countries and was then entered into force in 1998. It is currently ratified by 28 countries. And a very important piece of the protocol is that it prohibits all activities in Antarctica relating to the extraction of natural resources except for scientific research. The Antarctic Treaty System, it consists of two international bodies that I mentioned earlier, which is the ATCM, the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting, and then CAMLAR, the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. And so this map that you see here before you is all of the nation states that have interest and or scientific research stations on the continent, many of whom work in collaboration and also conduct unilateral research, scientific research, but also, participate in the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meetings as well as CAMLAR. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about the first half of the Antarctic Treaty System, the ATCM. And the photo that you see here before you to the right was taken from the ATCM this year in Berlin. It was hosted by it was hosted by Germany in Berlin. And the consultative parties of the Antarctic Treaty, they meet annually at the ATCM to discuss matters concerning Antarctica that include, tourism and climate change and management of land-based activities and management of historical sites and air safety in Antarctica. And they also adopt non-binding resolutions, decisions, and measures at this meeting. A part of the ATCM is the Committee for Environmental Protection. And the CEP, as we call it, was established by Article 2 of the Environmental Protocol. The CEP consists of representatives of the parties and meets annually in conjunction with the ATCM. And it is also attended by various observers, including ASOC, which I mentioned earlier in the presentation. The Committee for Environmental Protection provides advice and formulate recommendations to the ATCM on Antarctic environmental protection. Next slide, please. So I mentioned also earlier CAMLAR, which is the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. And in 1980, the convention was adopted and entered into force in 1982. And CAMLAR is a multilateral response to concerns regarding unregulated krill catches in the Southern Ocean. And so parties to the Antarctic Treaty, they urged that a definitive conservation regime needed to be created to ensure the protection of Antarctic marine ecosystems. And so from this conference of CAMLAR, the parties signed, in an agreement to create CAMLAR, which is the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. And the convention serves as a platform for international bodies to collaborate and manage fisheries in the Southern Ocean region. Next slide, please. So here's CAMLAR. CAMLAR is located here in Hobart, Australia, which is where I am currently. CAMLAR is an integral part of the Antarctic Treaty System. The CAMLAR Convention, the Antarctic Treaty, and the Environmental Protocol are among some of the key features that distinguish CAMLAR from regional fisheries management organizations, also known as RFMOs. The International Commission consists of 26 member nations, which you can see here, the member nation states that are on this slide. And the Commission also has a scientific committee, 2 subsidiary bodies, a host of working groups, I believe 4 working groups currently, and of course the CAMLAR Secretariat. And the scientific committee provides the best available science on harvesting levels and other management concerns pertaining to the living species that are in the Southern Ocean and in the Antarctic region. And then we have the two subsidiary groups that also meet annually, the Standing Committee on Implementation and Compliance, and the Standing Committee on Administrative and Finance Issues, and the working groups of the Ecosystem Monitoring, Management, Fish Stock Assessment, Statistics, Assessments, and Modeling, and the Incidental Mortality, with living resources in the Southern Ocean. And so the commission is responsible for establishing the regulatory framework that's applied to fishery management and ensures the conservation of Antarctic marine ecosystems supported by an ecosystem-based management support. Next slide, please. So here we're going to look at a little bit more about CAMLAR in depth. And CAMLAR adopts conservation measures that regulate fishing and related activities in the Southern Ocean. And so under Article 1 of the CAMLAR Convention, CAMLAR members are responsible for the conservation of various populations of fish, such as Patagonia toothfish, Antarctic toothfish, mackerel icefish, and Antarctic krill, and all other species of living organisms, including seabirds and penguins and seals, as well as the relationship of Antarctic marine living species, with their physical environment. Next slide, please. So CAMLAR is responsible for the management is responsible for the management of human activities in the Southern Ocean. So that would include harvesting of, krill, for example, or toothfish, and other, activities such as the transshipment at sea of these species from one vessel to another. And the management measures also apply to marine protected areas and Antarctic specially protected areas and specially managed areas in the CAMLAR Convention area. And management objectives must balance conservation using an ecosystem-based precautionary approach and rational use of Antarctic marine species. And all decisions in CAMLAR and within the ATCM must be agreed and taken through international consensus. Next slide, please. So it's important to make the distinction that CAMLAR is not a regional fisheries management organization, although CAMLAR has some attributes of an RFMO. CAMLAR is a management and governance regime whose objective is to preserve marine life and environmental integrity in and near Antarctica. Its mandate is broader than that of fisheries management, and the conservation standard for the application of ecosystem-based and precautionary fisheries management is embedded in the convention itself. So this is what more or less sets CAMLAR apart from other regional fisheries management organizations, such as other regional fisheries management that, manage, for example, the tuna fishery, in the Indian Ocean. Next slide, please. So here we have the CAMLAR Convention area. And this is what CAMLAR, more or less, this is the region or the area in which they govern. So to address the challenges of illegal and unreported and unregulated, also known as IUU fishing, CAMLAR, has established a range of measures to detect, deter, and eliminate IUU fishing taking place within the convention area that you see here outlined in red. And so fishing boundaries were created in the convention area that allows member states with fishing licenses to fish for, krill or Patagonia toothfish and icefish ice fish, excuse me, etc. And the convention area fisheries are managed, again, using an ecosystem-based and precautionary approach to ensure that, CAMLAR is consistent with the conservation principles of the CAMLAR Convention. And currently, I believe there are 13 licensed fisheries that target toothfish in the convention areas 48 and 58 and area 88. And krill fishing is primarily conducted in the convention sub areas 48.1, 48.2, and 48.3, and then a few divisions of 58, 4.1, and 4.2. Next slide, please. And so another very important responsibility of CAMLAR is the designation of a representative network of marine protected areas in the Southern Ocean. CAMLAR designated in, I believe it was 2012, to establish a representative network of large-scale no-take marine protected areas in the Southern Ocean within the convention area, which you just saw in the previous slide. And so in 2009, CAMLAR established the South Orkneys Island MPA, which is a region that it was their first MPA that they established. And it was the world's first high seas MPA also. And it covers approximately 94,000 square kilometers. And of course, is the feeding grounds for an array of birds, mammals, fish, and a host of invertebrates. The Ross Sea region MPA is currently the world's largest high seas MPA. In international waters, and it was designated by the Commission in 2016. And 72% of the total area includes a no-take zone, which forbids all fishing. And so other areas are reserved for scientific research, which I suspect that many of you may be doing when you head down to Antarctica, of krill and fish and those sorts of things. Which will, among other things, target monitoring and ecosystem changes. The Ross Sea MPA just came up on its 5-year anniversary, and many papers were submitted to the CAMLAR, the annual CAMLAR meeting that will take place in October, November of this year, to assess the effectiveness of the MPA, to evaluate and prove that MPAs are effective and in fact are climate change resilient to help ecosystems flourish and thrive in the face of impacts due to climate change. Next slide, please. So currently there are 3 proposed marine protected areas proposals that are submitted to CAMLAR. The first one is the Antarctic Peninsula, which is, the Western Antarctic Peninsula is the fastest warming area in the Southern Ocean and one of the fastest warming areas in the world. And then next we have the Weddell Sea and the East Antarctic MPA proposals that have been submitted to CAMLAR. Next slide, please. So here is just a slide that kind of gives you an overview, a timeline of Antarctic governance, and it also shows a bit of overlap of other international institutions that have some governance or management regulatory framework that overlaps with both the ATCM and CAMLAR, for example, like the International Whaling Commission or the Polar Code that looks at vessels, operating in polar waters, and a lot of this work from other international bodies is sometimes also taken into account in CAMLAR decisions that are made in the Commission. Next slide, please. So some of the current challenges that are currently being faced in Antarctic governance is considerable impasse, for example, geopolitics, and of course the elephant in the room, which is the invasion of Ukraine. It's a very unprecedented situation, to have one member country, Russia, invading another member country, which is Ukraine. There's also been some concerns around the effectiveness of the Antarctic Treaty System, giving the current geopolitics and the situation in Europe, and some other challenges that we've faced as well within the Antarctic Treaty System, or governance, if you will, is negotiations in CAMLAR over the past several years to advance. For example, future MPAs have stalled. There have been no new MPA designations, and there has been very little action taken on climate change. And sometimes some members will use consensus decision-making to prevent progress on Antarctic environmental protection. And of course, we all know that what happens in Antarctica doesn't stay in Antarctica. So it's very important, the work that observers and the NGO community, as well as the the Antarctic Treaty System governments, that we all work together to find our way through the impasse that we find ourselves currently facing, for greater protection of vulnerable species to climate change in Antarctica. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, the Antarctic Treaty System is recognized as one of the most successful sets of international agreements, which set an example to the world, that peaceful cooperation can happen between countries with competing interests. This was the main reason that the Antarctic Treaty came about, that 12 nations at the time, the USSR, with other nations, were able to come to a peaceful agreement to set aside Antarctica as a place for peace and science, and to conduct, most of that research in collaboration with one another. And CAMLAR is also a leader in ocean management and managing marine living species in the Southern Ocean. However, given the current challenges that I just mentioned, the Antarctic Treaty System finds itself in a very sort of interesting position, given the challenges that we have in figuring out, how can, the Antarctic Treaty System meet its obligations that was set forth in the treaty itself, such that, we can preserve Antarctica for future generations. Next slide, please. And so in conclusion, I leave you with a few resources that you can see here on ASOC and the Antarctic Treaty Secretariat and CAMLAR, as well as the ASOC digital story map that I myself personally put together for ASOC, that will give you a little bit more information in depth on more work on ASOC and more, information about Antarctic governance that wasn't explained here in detail. And just a personal message that I will leave you with from myself. I am a firm believer in this message for myself, actually, is that, I hope that each of you take, with you going down to the continent, just in your research, and just, when you come back, to mainland, that, you be the change in the world. And that's something that we certainly need right now within the Antarctic Treaty System, both within Antarctic polar science and research, as well as in policy and governance. And so we're trying to make positive and constructive change. And, I personally, commit to being a change, working for Antarctica through my work with ASOC, and of course, through my upcoming PhD research at the University of Tasmania. So on those parting, I leave you with those parting words, and thank you so very much for listening and joining in this morning to learn a little bit more about Antarctic governance. I look forward to answering any questions you might have, and then I will turn it over to Ikra.
Oh, actually, if you have any questions, definitely send them to me in the chat. We'll move on to Ikra and then take the questions together at the end. Thank you so much, Kimberly.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. That was a fantastic overview. I'm not sure I could have done a better job myself. So yeah, good to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us in the world. I will be joining you from Manchester, the UK, and I thought I would take Kimberly's contribution as a bit of a jumping off point to talk about challenges to Antarctic governance, past and future, just to give you a bit more of a slightly more complicated narrative about Antarctic governance, what it's looked like, what it currently looks like, and what it might look like in the future. So next slide, please. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about me. So I have a background in science myself, in physiological sciences from Newcastle University here in the UK. I then realised that I probably had a lot more time spent talking about science rather than actually doing it. During my undergrad, I thought perhaps there was something in that, and did a master's in science communication at the University of Manchester, which is the same department in which I began my PhD studies. So my thesis looked at the history of the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, and I'll tell you a bit more about that very shortly. During that time as well, I was very, very lucky to be able to complete a 3-month fellowship with the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology here in the UK, which was a fascinating insight into policy making, as was my time, which is kind of ongoing, as part of the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting rapporteur team. So I've been very lucky to be at the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting once in person in Prague in 2019 in the before times, and then once in 2021 during a very different version of the meeting, which was hosted by France and was completely virtual. So I was rapporteuring and even trying my hand at report adoption for the very first time, but from the comfort of my own room, and that felt very, very strange. So I bring some of those insights as well to my work. I'll just talk about my PhD on the next slide, please. So my PhD research, my thesis I handed in just a couple of months ago, pending Viva, so I hope to add a doctor to that title soon. But my research was basically an interdisciplinary project which looked at the archives of the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, which is the body that sort of oversees a lot of international collaborative projects in Antarctica. And what I did is bring together that archival material and apply a post-colonial theory approach to it, bringing sort of ideas from critical geography, from post-colonial theory, and also from the emerging field of science diplomacy studies, and kind of bring that critical view to a history of the governance of Antarctica and the way that science has always played a role in that. And eventually I came up with the argument that Antarctica is a place that is both colonized and beyond colonization, effectively arguing that Antarctica is a bit of a Schrodinger's experiment when it comes to international politics. So the existence of the Scientific Committee for Antarctic Research and other international bodies that oversee international collaboration kind of allow for these competing ideas about Antarctica to be true. So we know this idea of Antarctica as a continent for peace and science, and that is an idea that can completely coexist with the idea that Antarctica is actually a colonized space and always has been, which is really, really interesting and kind of at the crux of what I argue in my thesis. So next slide, please. What I and a lot of other Antarctic humanities scholars would argue is that our idea of Antarctica, our construction of Antarctica, is always being made and remade. So if I can talk you through a very short timeline of what that construction and reconstruction of Antarctica has looked like over the last 100 years or so, in the late 1800s and the start of the 20th century, Antarctica is very much seen as a blank at the bottom of the world map, a space to be explored, and a canvas upon which colonial ambitions, specifically heroic explorations, and those kind of ambitions could be writ large. It was all about flag planting and furthest south. In the post-war period, in the 1940s and 1950s, our perception of Antarctica changed quite a lot. It was a potential new arena for Cold War tensions. And then we found that in the 1950s, specifically in the late 1950s, it became a continent for peace and science, and this is one of the enduring images of Antarctica over the last 60 years or so. In the 1970s and 1980s, our perceptions of Antarctica changed once more, when it was seen as a potential source of mineral wealth and resources. And since the discovery of the ozone layer hole in 1987 and onwards, we've really seen the reframing of Antarctica once more as a fragile environment in need of protection. And just those framings of Antarctica are something I'd like you to keep in mind as I talk through past and future challenges to the Antarctic. Next slide, please. So I thought the best way to talk about the future is to look back to the past first. Next slide. When the Antarctic Treaty was first signed in 1959, there were quite a few early challenges to the Antarctic Treaty, to the negotiations process for the treaty. I think it's very easy to fall into the trap of kind of seeing the Antarctic Treaty as something that came along from the scientific goodwill of the International Geophysical Year of 1957 to 1958. But in effect, there were a lot of underlying issues which were really bubbling under the surface. So the first and possibly the most obvious of these issues and challenges to the Antarctic Treaty were the Cold War tensions and the idea of a red threat in Antarctica. So a study of archival research and some of the work done by my contemporaries shows that there were many sort of tensions about specific where the USSR or the Soviet bases were placed during the International Geophysical Year. And there was this question of, will the Russians leave the Antarctic at the end of the International Geophysical Year, or will they stay? And if they do, what does that mean? Specifically, there were a lot of expressions of anger and a reluctance initially to offer the Soviets a seat at the negotiating table when it came to the negotiations for the 1959 Antarctic Treaty. But it became very clear quite early on that an internationally binding agreement would not be possible without having both the US and the Russians at the table. So those Cold War tensions have always played a role in not only the creation of the Antarctic Treaty, but its enduring legacy. We also talk about the ABC or Antarctic problem. So the main reason why the sovereignty issues in Antarctica, which underlie the Antarctic Treaty, have never been resolved is because Argentina, Britain, and Chile, the ABC of this problem, lay claim to the exact same area of the Antarctic Peninsula with overlapping claims, and this has never been resolved. The Antarctic Treaty articles suspend all claims to Antarctic territory for as long as the Antarctic Treaty is in force, which both allows these sovereignty claims to exist and not exist at the same time, kind of keeping in mind that Schrodinger's experiment. There's also questions of the early criticisms of the Antarctic Treaty in the United Nations. In 1956, the Indian representative to the United Nations raised the question of how best to govern Antarctica, suggesting a form of internationalization. And it is argued by some scholars that this suggestion was what actually spurred on the 12 original signatories of the Antarctic Treaty to decide to make a smaller, more exclusive group of countries who would govern it instead. So these countries are often referred to as a collection of former imperial powers and or superpowers. Make of that what you will, it'll come up later on. And of course, there have always been questions as to the effectiveness of a system for Antarctic governance, which were effectively, as many would argue, quelled in the 1960s as we had the first 3 instruments of the Antarctic Treaty come into force. So that's the agreed measures for the conservation of Antarctic flora and fauna, the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Seals, and CAMLA, as described by Gimli. Next slide, please. So one of the things that Antarctic humanities scholars often find is that there are 3 spaces that are considered sort of beyond regular governance, so extrajudicial spaces, and these are outer space, Antarctica, and the high seas. And scholars that study one will find themselves linked to the other 2 spaces, and in many ways they are similarly administered. So in 1958, we had the first United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea conclude. In 1959, it was followed by the signing of the Antarctic Treaty, which was followed not long after by the signing of the Outer Space Treaty as well. So we're at this point in time, governance of these ungovernable spaces was beginning. And for possibly the best part of 2 decades, there weren't any major sort of challenges to the Antarctic Treaty or to these other spaces and the ways in which they were governed until the 1980s came along, and with it a slew of challenges to specifically the Antarctic Treaty as well, which is what I'll be focusing on. So by the 1980s, there was a large change in what the international political landscape looked like. So decolonization had changed all three of these spaces and would do forevermore. So the United Nations had gone from 51 founding states initially to 110 states by 1962, and by 1991 would grow to 159 states. The majority of these were formerly colonized and developing nations, which led to two movements at the United Nations, which named themselves the Group of 77 and the Non-Aligned Movement, which became very, very important during this period. So following the 1973 global oil crisis, I should say, mineral resources were very much on the international agenda, and the exploitation of these mineral resources, as well as the best possible way of extracting them and using the wealth from them in a equitable fashion, kind of dominated the conversation in the international political sphere. So there were lots of really interesting and very radical economic proposals that came forward in this time, none of which necessarily went anywhere, but really shaped two ideas at this time. The first of these is the idea of the global commons. So these spaces which would belong to everyone, and that could be hypothetically exploited for mineral resources, and the wealth from those resources potentially be distributed in an equitable way, primarily to countries in the global south rather than the global north. That was an idea that was very popular in the 1980s. Similarly, in 1967, we had the first mention of the common heritage of mankind. So the Maltese rep to the United Nations, Arvid Pardo, mentioned the common heritage of mankind, stating that some resources belong to all, including to future generations. And it was not long until both of these ideas became applicable to extrajudicial spaces like the high seas, which was very, very prominent throughout the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the third convention to exist, which concluded in the early 1980s. And it was not long since then that the same ideas were then applied to Antarctica. So if I could have the next slide, please. So the question of Antarctica was raised at several points at the United Nations. So it started in 1983, November 1983, when the Malaysian Prime Minister at the time, Mahathir bin Mohamad, raised the question of Antarctica as a debate to the United Nations General Assembly. As part of his speech, he appealed to his fellow Group of 77 and non-aligned movement countries, mentioning the common heritage of mankind, stating that Antarctica was a global commons, and calling for its international stewardship under the United Nations. Now, this led to prolonged debate, which has been covered by historian Peter J. Beck, who's written numerous books and articles on this. It really is a very, very interesting read if you're interested in it. There's a fantastic book called The International Politics of Antarctica that I would urge you to read. And at this point, Antarctica really became not only a prominent potential source of mineral wealth for many countries, but there was a debate about whether or not it was a colonized space, whether the Antarctic Treaty System was actually an old boys club of formerly imperial powers, and whether it was actually a vestige of colonialism rather than a radical new system of governance in the post-war period. What followed towards the end of the 1980s, after the discovery of the ozone layer, and later the negotiation of the 1991 Madrid Protocol, is the Antarctic Treaty System opened up to new members during the course of the 80s. So a lot of these included some of its strongest detractors, including China, Spain, Brazil, and India. And not long after these countries joined the Antarctic Treaty System, a lot of the debate about it died down in the United Nations. It can be argued that in opening up the Antarctic Treaty to a select few members, the Antarctic Treaty System could kind of reject claims that it was an exclusive club, and suggest that actually all countries could join, whilst effectively also having a high barrier to entry, because you have to show significant sort of scientific activity, which is a barrier that is not only particularly nebulous and difficult to define, but more often than not has quite an expensive threshold in terms of carrying that out. So there were some alternatives as proposed to the UN General Assembly, the main one being the international stewardship of Antarctica under the United Nations. Several others also called for the designation of Antarctica as a protected space, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. And as I sort of mentioned, it was resolved, but not really resolved. So the debate came up sporadically throughout the 90s, and it just kind of died down, but it's never really gone away. So I just ask you to bear that in mind as well. And next slide, please. The other major sort of challenge to the Antarctic Treaty was CRAMRA. So what is it? It's the Convention for the Regulation of Antarctic Mineral Resource Activities. Why have you not heard about it with all of the other instruments that Kimberly mentioned earlier? Well, it failed. So the convention was negotiated. It was signed by all of the Antarctic Treaty consultative parties. And eventually it was not ratified because Australia and France did not ratify it. And without that consensus, the negotiations and the convention itself failed to enter into force. What that meant actually was there was this opportunity to then talk about a different approach to mineral resource extraction. So CRAMRA's main difference from the Madrid Protocol, which took a lot of the negotiations and made them a lot more environmentally friendly, was that it would allow for the mining of resources in Antarctica, only if they were exploratory and with strict regulation. What changed in the 3 years since the failure of CRAMRA in 1989 to the eventual negotiation and signing of the 1991 Madrid Protocol is that a moratorium of 50 years on all mining activity in Antarctica was introduced, and a strict protocol for environmental protection, which led to the creation of the Committee for Environmental Protection. That was signed in 1991, fully ratified in 1998, and is now a moratorium that is in force. So this was one of the first challenges to the Antarctic Treaty System. It was the first time they'd negotiated something and it had failed. It was happening at the same time as the question of Antarctica was coming up in debate at the United Nations. And effectively, it all worked out fine in the end because we got the Madrid Protocol. But it's just something to bear in mind when thinking about Antarctic governance and the way that it's worked and hasn't worked in the past. A lot of these questions will be cropping up in the future. So without further ado, I'll talk about the future now. So next slide, please. Bearing in mind all of the various bits of information I've given you, the main obvious challenge to the Antarctic Treaty System is the same as the challenge to Antarctica, which is climate change. I think Kimberly mentioned that very little is done at the Antarctic Treaty System to combat climate change. As someone who's been at a couple of them, I can nod my head and say there is a lot of talk and not very much entering into force, because consensus is a very difficult thing to achieve across 27 consultative parties, now 28, I do believe. But yes, whether it be the melting of the ice sheets, the retreating of glaciers, and the impacts on wildlife and marine life, and the devastating effects of sea level rise, climate change is by far and large the largest challenge, not only to the Antarctic continent, but also to the legitimacy of the Antarctic Treaty System, if nothing continues to be done, which takes me on to my next slide. Thank you. So this is an idea, an ideological challenge, almost a gauntlet thrown down to the Antarctic Treaty System countries. It's in a paper that came out this last year. Peter Roberts, a contemporary of mine, introduced this idea of the consequence principle, which suggested that a lot of the consultative parties to the Antarctic Treaty, who are instrumental in making decisions about governing the continent, are not actually the parties or the states that would be most affected by climate change and sea level rise. So in his paper, Professor Roberts suggests that countries such as Kiribati or Bangladesh, which will be largely underwater, if not completely submerged in the event of sea level rise by 2050, might actually be given consultative party status at the Antarctic Treaty meeting for a more equitable decision making in the future. So just something to bear in mind, a really interesting idea and a challenge to the Antarctic Treaty System as it stands. Next slide, please. There are, of course, alternatives to the Antarctic Treaty System. We've talked about some of these already. The designation of Antarctica as a world park is a really interesting idea that came about in the late 80s as pioneered by Greenpeace. who suggested removing all human presence, including a scientific research presence from the continent. We've talked about the internationalization under UN stewardship. The other alternative to the Antarctic Treaty System might be explored in 2048, when the end of the Madrid Protocol comes about. I say end in quotes because it's just the end of the 50-year moratorium included in the protocol and not the protocol itself. But that renegotiation of a possible future moratorium will involve the consensus of a lot more countries, first of all, which may not necessarily want to include more of a mining moratorium. So whether or not the Antarctic will be mined is completely up in the air at the moment. So yet another thing to bear in mind, another challenge that's yet to be resolved. And finally, I'll just go to my last slide, which is one of the great things that I kind of advocate is having a look at these post-colonial and decolonizing approaches to Antarctica, which are very new, a completely different challenge, if you like, to Antarctic governance, is a new approach to the study of Antarctic governance. So in assuming that colonial logics have already been applied to Antarctica, we can view the activities of Antarctic governmental and non-governmental actors in a completely different way. We can kind of start to pull apart some of those political agendas and to bring a different appraisal of the future of the Antarctic Treaty to the table, which allows us to look at those alternatives and how likely it might be that they're enforced, to maybe dream of new alternatives, and basically be able to approach the question of what does the future of the Antarctic Treaty System look like. And that is where I will leave it. I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We have loads of questions, so I'll pick through them and sift through them. One question nearer to the start was, do marine protected areas within CCAMLR's domain have additional regulations on top of CCAMLR management? And either of you can take that.
I will defer to Kimberly on that one.
Yeah, I was actually looking for the raise the hand gesture button, and I was a little slow to grab it. To answer the question, I would probably say no. I mean, you know, the MPAs are designated, you know, by CCAMLR, you know, in the Southern Ocean within the convention area. I mean, of course, I think that CCAMLR would already take into consideration some other, you know, international agreements, for example, UNCLOS, you know, the law of the sea and that sort of thing. But generally speaking, the regulation of MPAs is generally decided by CCAMLR, and, you know, they decide which areas will be regulated, for example, where there will be no fishing conducted, only where scientific research can take place. For example, if in the domain 1 MPA, if it were to be established, the scientific committee and the commission, all CCAMLR members would have to agree on an appropriate krill catch limit, you know, to be extracted or taken out of the Southern Ocean and that sort of thing. So most of the regulatory management and governance measures of any MPA in the Southern Ocean are generally, you know, done by CCAMLR and not by any other international body.
Okay, thank you. We have a question that might have been alluded to or touched on at some point in time during both of your presentations, but based on international condemnation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what is the status of Russian multilateralism and foreign policy in the Antarctic? Does Russia or other aligned nations seek to distance themselves from any Antarctic NGOs or IOs? To the best of your knowledge. Go ahead, Ikra.
So I don't have the freshest take on this, in that I was not one of the rapporteurs at this year's Antarctic Treaty consultative meeting just a couple of months ago. One of the things I will point out that in the Arctic Council for the very first time, there was a statement released by 4 of the 5 Arctic Council members which condemned the invasion of Ukraine. Russia was the member that did not condemn the invasion of Ukraine. And that was historical, it's unprecedented, it's never happened before. So I'd say in terms of a simple answer to this question was simply in unprecedented times and unprecedented waters. In terms of the Antarctic, I will defer to Kimberly because I feel like she has something to add there, but multilateral agreements, especially when they are between scientific bodies, have often historically survived beyond sort of like international political differences. So a clear example of that in the Antarctic Treaty is that the UK and Argentina sat down at the Antarctic Treaty despite the ongoing Falklands War. And so, yeah, just looking at historical examples, that's not always the case. But again, we are in unprecedented times.
Yeah, and just to contribute to Ikra's response, I was present at this year's ATCM. I was not attending in a capacity as a rapporteur, but more or less on the ASOC delegation. And, you know, all member countries, you know, called out, you know, the invasion of Ukraine, you know, by Russia. You know, the meeting was not entirely contentious, you know, but I mean, Russia was very adamant about having that particular piece of information removed from the report adoption of the ATCM. And, you know, over the, I would say the past few years, I did also attend the ATCM virtually. I believe it was in 2021, as Ikra mentioned, that was hosted by France. And so quite a lot of time, you know, Russia will do a lot of different tactics to sort of stall progress or hinder, you know, any sort of consensus on, you know, very important matters to the Antarctic Treaty System. But to another point that Ikra pointed out, I mean, you know, Russia was also a part of, you know, the Ross Sea, for example, marine protected area that was established by CAMLAR. And so this was like, you know, one of the most shining examples of, you know, again, when we can see, you know, international collaboration at its finest in such a very positive manner. And right now, it is not entirely clear, you know, if Russia wants to sort of distance itself from, you know, the rest of the parties and CAMLAR members in terms of, you know, progress. They're certainly making things very difficult, which has created the impasse within the Antarctic Treaty System, which makes it very difficult to sort of progress on any of these issues. And currently right now, you know, many of the the Antarctic Treaty governments, as well as the NGO community and observer communities are looking at, you know, other ways, you know, given this unprecedented situation to figure out, you know, how we can, you know, address, you know, some changes and move forward, you know, either both with Russia or without Russia. All of these things are still up for debate. And certainly above my pay grade. But that's probably the best formulated answer that I think I can, you know, give to that question. So thanks for that very important question.
Thank you. So we have two CAMLAR questions. Let's start with this one. I'm not sure if we'll have time for both. Given CAMLAR's mandate for the conservation of marine living species, if it continues to be unable to find consensus around real conservation measures such as MPAs and not just fisheries management measures, what future might it have as a functional international organization?
Ikram, do you want to start or shall I?
I think you've got a bit more expertise on this, so I will defer to you.
Yeah, okay, no worries. Thanks so much for, that question. That is actually the billion-dollar question. You know, the question in the room right now that the Antarctic Treaty System is actually been looking at, that a lot of different scholars and experts, you know, who have been in this field for a very long time have also been looking at, as well as, you know, I understand that many are looking at international law and other different areas to, you know, figure out the best way forward. In, you know, given the current circumstances, that still remains to be seen what that will look like. I mean, I'm a firm believer in, you know, that I don't necessarily per se think that we need a new international body. We just need to figure out how we can work within the current mechanisms and institutions that we have, either looking at, I don't know, something like a new phenomena of adaptive governance, or just the way that we think about policy decision making,
you know, and how we implement these things for a region that is very sensitive to, you know, a lot of different changes and impacts. And so the short answer really is that I don't really have an answer to your question, to that question. That is, you know, like I said, the question and the topic of discussion, of debate currently within the CAMLAR, you know, I guess, framework, and also within the larger Antarctic Treaty System framework. You know, that they're looking at figuring out, you know, what can we do? Because again, you have to remember that all decisions within the Antarctic Treaty System are taken by consensus. And so Russia will also have to be part of that consensus decision making, you know, what will happen going forward. And so no decision can essentially be made without the consensus of Russia, along with the other 26 excuse me, along with the other 25 members in CAMLAR. So, you know, it's up for debate. It's still being sorted out. We hope that, you know, the hope is that, you know, not to turn anyone away from the table, but to always figure out how we can keep lines of communication open, you know, with Russia, and sort of bring them back. Not necessarily just to our side, but just to a point where we can even communicate with one another. And I think that's very important. You know, when there is a breakdown in communication, it is very hard to sort of move forward on any topic or issue for that matter. And so I think, you know, that's kind of where we are right now on that. And, you know, we hope that, you know, in the next coming years that, you know, CAMLAR can find itself right side up again, you know, like in the sake of, you know, when we were able to designate the Ross Sea and make a lot of other things happen. We've seen that we can do these things, we can continue to do these things, but of course, public policy is very slow, and, you know, and so is geopolitics. A lot of it is very geopolitical right now. And so we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But, you know, trust and know that the NGO community and observers and other CAMLAR member countries are working very hard and are dedicated to this very question and to this issue right now, and figuring out, you know, how can CAMLAR meet its objectives and its goal, you know, to the convention, you know, and its obligations.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you. With that, we will close. Actually, Ikra, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
I've just got a quick comment. So I think one of the things that we kind of talk about when it comes to CAMLAR and the Antarctic Treaty System is that there's almost like a threefold challenge to any decision making, which is that the first and most obvious challenge is getting an internal consensus in that governance space. The second is kind of getting that external validation from sort of international approval outside of CAMLAR or the Antarctic Treaty System. And it's about finding that really difficult balance between sort of finding a regulatory system that works, that does what it's intended to do, whilst not undermining other uses of that space. And that's kind of the difficulty that I think CAMLAR and the Antarctic Treaty System face. And that's a difficult balance that Kimberly kind of refers to. So just worth bearing that in mind.
Yes, thank you. And thank you both so much for your expertise. And thank you everyone in the audience for your questions. Really appreciate those coming in. Feel free to get involved in some upcoming PASECO opportunities that are pulled up on the slide. We have some exciting funding opportunities in the pipeline supporting accessibility efforts in polar science. And you can also connect with PASECO on our website at www.paseco.org. Thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.
Thank you, everyone.